So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to introduce you to our first speaker now, Carol, and she's traveled a very long way to be with us today from the US. Carol Fox is the Vice President of Strategic Initiatives at the Risk Management Society. She's a Miami University graduate and has held progressively responsible risk management positions in the customer care, telecom, manufacturing, defense, and insurance industries. She's known for her risk management experience and writings. She received the RIMS 2009 Goodall Award. In 2011, the Treasury and Risk named her as one of the 100 most influential people in finance. Carol is the chair of the US ISO 31000 Risk Management Standards Technical Advisory Group. She's a participant in the COSO ERM Advisory Council, and she serves on Miami University's Center of Business Excellence Advisory Board. Please help me welcome Carol onto the stage as she gives us an insight into the developments of risk management in the US. Welcome with us.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. I very much appreciate that warm welcome and your very kind words, and Jillian as well, about our conference. I did have a little bit of time. I decided to come to Africa early, not only to acclimate myself so I'm not falling asleep here at the podium while I'm speaking with you, but got a chance to go to Victoria Falls. So I just came back from there, had a very powerful experience. The water was just amazing. We have our own falls in the US, but it was truly a very powerful experience, which I think was symbolic of the power of Africa and the emerging markets here. So that was very exciting. As I stood there and looked at the falls, I was imagining myself back when they were first discovered. So I think we're on a journey in risk management of discovery, and we'll talk a little bit about the evolution of risk management as well. And the other thing that crossed my mind, I'm not sure how they worked this out, but there was always a rainbow. So I'm not sure how they did that, but the color of the rainbow and the beauty of the rainbow was very, very impressive to me, so I appreciate that. So I wanted to get a sense, as I'm speaking with you, about who we are in the room. So as I go through each of these, if you could just indicate by raising of your hands if you're involved in this industry. So anyone here involved in education? Technology? Few. Financial institutions? Okay, we have quite a few of those, good. Healthcare? Transportation? I see a few hands. Social services? Okay, manufacturing? Retail, insurance, okay, a few more hands there. Mining, a few hands. Hotels. Okay. So the one thing I wanted to note here, and I often ask people, if I asked you to write down your mission, take a moment. Do you understand what the mission of your organization is? So take a moment and write it down, because I think we need to understand why we're doing what we're doing as an organization, first of all. So I'll give you just a moment. I'm often amazed as I ask this question around the world, how many people look at me with a bit of a puzzle. What do you mean, our mission? It's what we're trying to do. So I'll share with you RIMS mission, and we just changed it, so I have a cheat sheet here. But RIMS mission is to educate, engage, and advocate for the global risk management community. Our old mission was to advance risk management. We've broadened that in our mission and what we're doing. Regardless of your mission, though, it's important to understand that you have the same goal. So all of us are about the success of our organizations. The other thing I think we end up confusing is our definitions about risk. So what exactly do we mean when we talk about risk? So the first reference I could find was a 1921 reference where Robert Knight, in a book entitled Risk, Uncertainty, and Profit, defined risk as measurable uncertainty, and then defined the term uncertainty as an unmeasurable future event. So we get a definition of risk as a measurable, unmeasurable future event. Is it any wonder that we continue to confuse people about what we're talking about? So another source that I went to was Wikipedia, of course, the truth of everything, right? So they define risk, this hasn't changed, is the potential that a chosen activity or action, including the choice of inaction, would lead to a loss or an undesirable outcome. So if you think about risk as a loss only, you get reactions that I used to get when I would walk into one of our distribution centers and they'd say, "Oh no, Carol's here. We must have done something wrong." So that you get that kind of thing. At RIMS, we think about it as an uncertain future outcome that can either improve or worsen our position. So it's more closely aligned with the ISO 31000 definition of risk as the effect of uncertainty on an organization's objectives. So as I'm speaking about that, think about it on a personal basis of how much am I willing to give, whether it's my time, whether it's my treasure, or other things, for what reward? So as we think about risk now at RIMS, we talk about reward as being not the opposite, but very much an element of risk and risk-taking. The first inkling I had on this, I'll share with you. I was with a company called Convergence, and we had a lot of operations in Florida. So if you're familiar with Florida, it's very prone to hurricanes. I was on a plane to New York for underwriter meetings, and I was sitting next to a gentleman, and we were talking about things that we were working on. Well, this was April. Our hurricane season begins in June. I said, "Oh, well, we're working very diligently on our preparations for the hurricane season." And he looked at me and says, "Hurricanes, we love hurricanes." I thought, how can you love hurricanes? Can you tell me, could you guess what business he was in? Construction? Okay, I'm hearing murmurings, but I'm not catching. Okay. So he was actually with ShopVac, which is a manufacturer of the machines that clean up the water. So I thought, okay, here I'm thinking of it as a loss. You know, we were working to make sure our operations could continue, and he was thinking, oh, our sales go up even with the threat of hurricanes. They don't even have to have hurricanes, they just threaten it and our sales go up. So if you think about how we often think of risk as something we need to prevent, he was actually thinking it as value creation. So I wanted to share with you when Jillian asked me to come and talk about the trends in the US or developments in risk management. So I thought we'd limit it to 3. So we're going to talk about risk and value. We're going to talk about a study that we did with Marsh on emerging risk that's recent. And then the last topic we'll talk about is risk reputation and decision making. But I think it's often, and I want you to focus on the picture of the rose there. Because often as we look at risk and we're tasked as risk professionals, we're asked to see something that may not be as obvious to anybody else. So as you look at that rose, do you see anything else? Tell me what you see. A rose is a rose is a rose. Do you see the dolphin? Kind of toward the top. So we as risk professionals are often asked to see something that maybe no one else sees. So to start talking about our trends now, we're going to start with the integration with strategy planning and execution. That is how risk can actually help create value as well as protecting firm value. We do a survey with Marsh once a year. We've just finished our 13th year, and we announce our results at the annual conference. 2 years ago, in 2014, we asked the C-suite this question. In considering the risk management needs of your organization over the next 3 to 5 years, which abilities and areas of knowledge will be most important? 67% said strategy and execution aptitude. 55% said business acumen. 35% planning and organizing capabilities. Risk management technical abilities was less than 20%. So as we look at our certifications, and as we look at the competencies that our organizations are looking for out of us, it's important to understand that they really want us to be partners with them in the business. So that was a bit of a learning for us as we went through that. Now, RIMS also, and this is very much a US thing, so as we talk about risk management, we always categorize things. So risk management has grown up with such a tie to insurance. As we looked at a broader risk management capability, we termed it enterprise risk management. Because of our requirements, because of the way we, Sarbanes-Oxley, and many of you may or may not be familiar with that, but particular regulation around reporting and financials. We begin to think about risk management, less about insurance, less about regulation, but more in areas of a broader sense across the enterprise, but also how do we tie that into the strategy of the organization? So one of my tasks when I first joined RIMS was to get together with a group of professionals and define what do we mean by strategic risk management. The term was being thrown around quite a bit by a number of different organizations. So we came up with this definition that it's really a discipline that drives deliberation and action regarding those uncertainties and untapped opportunities that affect an organization's strategy and strategy execution. We often find organizations who said, not really interested in this whole concept of enterprise risk management, but strategic risk management is really what we want to apply in our organization. As we think about the power of risk management, it really comes down to decisions. The decision is, should this key risk be controlled, which is our first response generally, or can we exploit it? So if you follow the bars on the orange, this is our typical response. What are the 3 to 5 worst things that can happen? And then how do we either reduce the likelihood of them happening or the severity if they do happen? And then how do we build that into our execution plan? What if we looked at what are the 2 to 5 best things that could happen if we exploit this risk? And then what can we do and incorporate in our execution plan to make sure those things happen in a very favorable way? So we have the input of the strategic risks, and as we build both of those into our execution plan, obviously there will be risk arising from that. I want to give you a little bit of a story. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the University of California, Davis at all? Anybody been to California? Davis? Well, they have about 1,200 olive trees on the campus, and as you might imagine, it's quite beautiful there. But they were having a problem. What happens to olives when they ripen? Anybody? They fall, right? Fall down. And they create a tripping or a fall hazard. And they were seeing quite a few claims coming out, not only from students, but visitors and faculty. In fact, they had a 7-figure lawsuit. So they got together and said, what can we do about this? And so the first response they had was, well, let's just cut all the trees down. Get rid of the problem. But they decided that would really ruin the ambiance of the campus. So their second thought was, well, we'll just increase our cleanup schedule. We'll just clean up these olives more often, but then that would add to their operating expenses. So the head groundskeeper said, I know what we'll do. We'll harvest the darn things, we'll make olive oil out of it, and we'll sell it at the bookstore. And once everybody stopped laughing, that's exactly what they did. If you go onto their website, you will see that they do sell olive oil. They've expanded their product to body oil, and also canned olives. And guess what? The 1,200 olive trees that they have on campus weren't enough to meet their demand. So they actually engaged other olive growers in the area, and they have a nice little business. So they've created value from something that they first considered to be just a loss. So how do we know that risk management can create value? This was actually a question that we heard quite a bit. Yes, we know intuitively that risk management will help us, but how do we actually show that value? So we partnered with Mark Farrell of Queen's University Management School a few years ago, who looked at the data within our, and Ronan Gallagher from Edinburgh, two professors, who looked at the data in our risk maturity model to see if they could find any correlations between value and good attributes or mature risk management attributes. And they found an actual highly correlated, it was 98%, between those that have mature risk maturity in their organizations and the firm value of a 25% premium. Now, if that doesn't convince a CEO that this is real and it's something you should work on, it's a pretty powerful message. The other thing they found is that as we looked at each of the 7 attributes that we have in our risk maturity model, the one that made the biggest difference was performance management. And it's interesting to see that while each of these attributes was additive, they actually, in total, came out to a higher percentage. But from a valuation perspective, the greatest advantage was really embedding the discipline throughout the organization. So it's not about the risk management function, it's really about as people consider risk in their everyday activities. So I have a question for you, and you don't have to answer this out loud, but I want you to think about this because these are important questions. What creates value in your organization? What is it that you're doing in your organization that's creating value for your customers? This is a question I used to ask our strategy people. What is it we're doing what makes people want to buy from us? And then how are we capturing that value? Let me ask you, how many of you use Google? Is that available here? Okay. I was in China and it's not, so now I know that when I travel internationally, I first have to ask that question. So how many of you use Google? Okay. What value are you getting out of it? Lots. What value? What is that? Lots value. Information. Saving time, you get the information quickly. Okay, so that's creating a value for you, isn't it? And how much are you paying Google for that? Zip. How much would you be willing to pay Google for that? Zip, because there are other search engines, right? So how is Google capturing value from what they're doing? Adverts, right? Because if you look up something and then you go back later, you find out that if you were searching for hotels in Santon, South Africa, all of a sudden all these ads come up for Garrett's competitors because they know I'm looking for that. So they're selling that information so you are actually giving them something of value, and they're capturing that value from you, and then they're using it for their customers. So that's an important question to ask as you work with your strategy people. The other question is, how is strategy set, communicated, and executed within your organization? I remember talking to a group of our contact centers, and our contact center people were responsible for their own P&L. So one of the things I wanted to talk to them was, did they understand the strategy of the entire organization and how they fit into it? So I called the CEO's office, and I said, could you send me the strategy so I can distribute it to all of these business owners? And the answer was, I can't share that with you. That's a secret. So what are you, these are people who you're asking to execute strategy, and yet we're not willing to share that. I ended up getting a copy, by the way, but it was on one page. But understanding how is that communicated within your organization, do people really understand what part they have in that strategy? And then another question to ask is, what's the attitude toward risk management within your organization? Do they call you first or last? Are you asked to clean up the messes? Are you asked to participate before messes occur? So what is the attitude within the organization? And does that culture within your organization actually support this strategic risk management proposition that we're talking about? So good to know. So I just attended at the RIMS conference a follow-on workshop, and one of the presenters was Martin Vilso, and he'll forgive me if I mispronounce his name, of Implement Consulting Group. And he said, we really need to change the risk conversation. It's not about risk. It's about making choices within an organization. So what is our aspiration? What is it we want to be when we grow up? Where will we play? Will we play in a region? Will we play globally? How will we win? What are we going to do that's different from our competitors? And what capabilities are needed within the organization in order to execute it? And are our management systems suitable? So it's not just our information management systems, but how the entire systems and ecosystem of the organization works together. So a much broader idea about systems capability. So we're going to take this concept that Martin presented at this workshop, and we're going to work through a couple of examples. And as I talk about each of the trends today, I'm going to give you examples from real companies. So Dr. Paul Walker, we work very closely with. He serves on our Strategic Risk Management Development Council. Dr. Walker is with St. John's University in New York City. And he has this concept of good, great, gone. And he calls it a real strategic lesson for risk professionals. So as we look at these three groups that he presented in one of our risk summits, what's the difference between each of these groups? So think about that for a moment. And then any brave soul willing to tell me what the difference is among these? Okay, exactly right. The first group, they're all gone. Second group. They've been on the Fortune 500 for some time. Very good. New kids on the block. Okay, very good. If we have a prize, if we have any prizes, I didn't bring any from RIMS, but if we could give that to Gerhard. Very good. So that's exactly right. And on top of that, the average time a Fortune 500 company would spend on the Fortune 500 list in 1955 was about 65 years. More recently, it's about 15 years. So if you think about the value destruction that's occurred over time, and Shirley mentioned about the pace of change, this is an example of that. The other thing I wanted to talk with you about, because this is a concept that was introduced by Dr. Carl Spetzler. Dr. Spetzler is associated with Stanford University. He's president and CEO of Stanford Decision Group, and he talks about a convergence between risk management and decision science. He's a decision science. And one of the things he presented to us was that you can have a good decision and have a great outcome. But you can also have a good decision and have a bad outcome. You, believe it or not, management can take a bad decision, and you're going, what are you thinking? And actually come out with a good outcome. But obviously, if it's a bad decision and a bad outcome, we've all seen those, right? So this whole concept of good decision, bad decision, and outcomes, I wanted to spend a bit of time talking about that, and I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to ask you a question. I want you to work in your groups for about 5 minutes. And just, I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story. And then you tell me, we'll come back, you tell me whether this was a good decision or a bad decision. So this is an actual case study. There is an organization, a company that's traded on the stock market in the US, headquartered in Atlanta, Georgia. They're a furniture manufacturer. And they took the decision, a few years ago, a number of years ago, to do their manufacturing, moving it from North America, from the US, to China. Obviously, lower labor costs, goods, and they thought this was the way to go. So I'd like you to spend a few minutes with your table mates to say, do you think this was a good decision or a bad decision? Okay. All right. And this is a group effort. There are no right or wrong answers, but I will give you the outcome in a moment. Good decision? Okay, there are a few of you. All right. Bad decision? Okay, not equally split. And some of you still don't know whether it was a good decision. There is a good and bad. Okay, so they've got one of these going on over at that table. All right, that's fine. Well, I'll tell you what the outcome is. And before I do that, I didn't want to mention that you will be getting copies of these slides. Some of these are somewhat dense, so we do have a PDF that you'll be able to download from the Institute's website after the session. So, da-da-da-da. Bad outcome. Bad outcome. So and also these were the pieces of information that you didn't have to evaluate whether this was a good or bad decision. So the biggest drop in stock for this company occurred the World Trade Center. Obviously, a lot of things collapsed, particularly in the US, after the World Trade Center attacks. So their stock went down like everyone else's did. Then 2 years later, their stock dropped again significantly. They had a supply chain backlog that occurred, and the market didn't like that. So they started selling off the stock. Oh, oops, a year later it happened again. They're a retailer. A lot of their sales is seasonal, happens at the Christmas season. People go out and buy furniture for themselves, right? Or the kids are getting out and they're getting their own places. Happens again. Not only that, a week later it happens again. Big stock drops. Obviously, the market didn't believe what their tale was. So the other piece of information that you didn't have is that their market was southern US. So they were producing things in Asia. They were bringing them back. Big transportation costs that had not been considered. And damage to the furniture. So they would get the furniture there, and something had been damaged in shipment, and they had to send it back to be repaired. So the market says, this model's just not working for us. We just don't believe that you're going to be able to meet the demand during the period of time when you have your greatest sales. So I'm going to step away from the case study. We'll come back to it in a minute, because they did solve their problems. Oh yeah, the other thing they did is they put the person in charge of this long supply chain. Guess who they chose out of their executive team? The head of HR. So you'll see now why I'm not identifying who they are. So I'm going back to Dr. Spetzler's concept of the elements of decision quality. And let's talk about where risk management plays in this. So he talks about having this appropriate frame. What issue are we trying to solve? What's the context of what we're trying to do here? So first of all, you have to think about what you're trying to solve for. Secondly, you think about what are your alternatives? What are the doable alternatives? So did they consider alternatives in this case study? Maybe, maybe not. And did they do that analysis with any kind of formal approach? Did they have meaningful, reliable information? So you're looking at these doable alternatives. Do you really have good information that you can rely on in order to help the decision that you're going to take? And then does the organization truly understand the trade-offs? What are they willing to risk for what value? What are those trade-offs, and do we understand those? And then using a logically correct reasoning to come to an ultimate commitment to action. Too often, his point is, and that's the 1, 2, 3, we start with the commitment to action. we're going to relocate our manufacturing in Asia. And then we start looking at meaningful, reliable information that may or may not have it, and then looking at different alternatives. So the way we approach a decision should be methodical and logical and consider the risks, both the upside and downside. So what did they do? In 2010, they began to really incorporate risk management into their strategic decision making. Prior to that, risk management was primarily insurance and claims and more of the traditional role. And they started looking at correlations with their sales. And they began to see a very strong correlation with GDP, our gross domestic product in the US, and also with home sales. So they've had two elements that they began to analyze, and they went back in time to see how closely they were correlated. So they began to use these two elements in order to predict what their sales might be, which was very different. They also changed their sourcing model. They still source out of Asia, but the manufacturing is done locally. So it helped their decision making. So just an example of how risk management came to play. And the change, they built investor confidence. So this is a comparison with the S&P 500 index, and you can see their stock price has basically since 2011 has outperformed the 500, so they've actually created additional value for their organization. Now it's back down close to the S&P. Would you venture to guess why that might be? I'm sorry? Yeah, so they're following home prices that are down in the US. But there's a lot more uncertainty right now for a number of different reasons in the US. So they see that uncertainty playing out with what they're trying to do. So I wanted to also give you an example. This is an example from Paychex. Frank Fiorelli, who's the chair of our ERM committee, who's been doing risk management for a very long time, very successfully, has a model that he uses in how do you develop, communicate, and execute strategy, and how does risk management play into that. And his point is, as risk professionals, we really need to be the questioners. So some people call it devil's advocate, but really talking to the people who are putting the strategy together and saying, as we develop these very high-level strategies and we begin to look at allocation of resources, given the ecosystem in which we live, what's our appetite for risk? What are we willing to risk for what type of reward? Given our appetite, have we got the right business model? So they actually question their business model as they go through their strategy development. And then are we comfortable with the assumptions we've made? That's an area often, at least my experience with strategy planners, is that they make assumptions, they don't document them, and they never go back and take a look at whether their assumptions were actually accurate. So those are some of the things that he does as a risk professional as part of the development of the strategy. And then communicating that strategy. Once those high-level strategies have to be translated into specific business objectives for the specific business units, what's the appetite within those specific entities or those business units that they have? Question that. How do we assess what our risk appetite is on a particular product or service? And then how do we allocate those either by risk category or by product category or service category? The thing that he's been able to do at Paychex, which I wish we all had the luxury of, is he has a number of actuaries and a number of scientific, technical people who actually work in risk management. And often they'll come to him and say, we're thinking about this project, product, service. Could you help us model this out and so that we've got the right assessments in terms of launching this new product? And then finally, executing strategy. They go back and they take a look as they're executing the strategy. Are we on track as to where we thought we would be? Are we operating within the risk appetite that we thought we were taking? It also gives them the opportunity to say, not only are we taking on too much risk, are we taking on enough risk? He has in common, Paychex has in common with a number of other organizations that I've talked to, where they think about risk management from a strategic standpoint. They often come back to the board, and the board says, I don't think we're taking enough risk. Have you ever come across that here? No, you don't have to answer that. But it's much more fun to be in a position to say, we can take on more risk than what we thought we could in order to create more value. Do we have the right level of controls? Are the outcomes what we expected? Are we seeing bad outcomes or good outcomes? And are there things that we ought to be modifying as we're executing? And then are we aligning to what we thought we were going to do from a strategic standpoint? So Paul Walker would call this good, great, managed, and not gone. So trend 2. Let's focus on these swans. We've all heard about black swans. Dr. Walker also believes that being able to spot swans, and he has different definitions of them, is a core competency for risk management. So the white swans are the known knowns, the things that we know and we must see, the market expects it. He calls them gray swans, things that we probably should have seen, but we didn't see. And then the black swans truly are the things that we couldn't have seen. Why does it matter? Stakeholders will forgive black swans. Okay, we get it. You couldn't see that coming. All right, we understand that. But if they happen over and over, or if they're white or gray swans that you don't see coming, that you don't respond to, or you don't take some action on, it really signals a lack of management and risk competence and or poor board oversight. So we're hearing more and more from the boardroom. They want to know what's coming around the corner. So this was an area we focused on in this year's survey, Excellence in Risk Management Survey with Marsh, and we had 4 key themes. First, we found that definitions tend to be a problem in this area. How do you go about assessing and modeling emerging risks? How do you forecast them? And then, what investment do you make in this competency, as Dr. Walker calls it? So one of the comments that we had in one of our focus groups was the fact that the standards haven't been set yet for defining what is an emerging risk. Marsh has a center, Global Risk Center, in which they define emerging risk as being complex threats and opportunities that can have significant unexpected impacts. They happen very quickly, sudden shifts, and they're hard to predict due to their interdependencies with other issues. In our Strategic Risk Management Implementation Guide at RIMS, we take these random, seemingly unpredictable and unconnected issues, trends. That's our world of emerging and dynamic risks that have a potential impact on our strategy. And part of what we're asked to do is, are these threats, are these opportunities, or both? So we define emerging risk as a novel manifestation of risk, or a type that's not been previously experienced. Now this is from the viewpoint of the organization. It's not that they haven't occurred elsewhere or in a different way, but it's from the viewpoint of the organization. And then we said, risks change. So it may be a known risk, because of the change, either in the economy or other things, that a risk will move from one to another. It's seen differently, and it may change over time. So we define those as dynamic risks. Just shared that with you because I think it came out in the report. The question we ask is, from which of the following do you think the next critical risk for your organization will emerge? And I found it interesting to look at this list versus the list that the institutes did. A very fine report. I explained to Jillian, I think that was an excellent report. I had a chance to take a look at it that you've done. And you can see this list here. I won't go through it. But the next question we ask, over what time period are these going to occur, do you think? So the same list of risks, over what time period? And it's obvious to see some of these risks are already a significant concern for the organizations. So one of the things, so we bucketed these into the here and now, the cyber attacks and regulations, things that are just around the corner, talent availability, fiscal crises, and on the horizon. So I'm going to ask you to take 3 minutes with your team. You guys are bonding, right? With your team to say, from a South Africa perspective, where would you bucket these? Are they the same as what we've done in the US, or is this different from your point of view halfway around the globe? Okay. Same or different? Just quickly. Same? Different. It's what I expected, because it really does depend on your perspective and the environment that you're in terms of what is an emerging risk or dynamic risk. We often in risk management talk about these as if they're the same, and they're not. And they may be different even from organization to organization. So I brought some friends with me. I'm going to let them talk for the next moment. And I've got one woman who's going to explain to you how they look at emerging risk within her organization.
I'm the enterprise risk manager, and we have a team of risk owners that comprise the risk committee. The risk owners monitor risks as they are attending meetings and basically engaging in daily work and working with the risks that we've already identified in our portfolio. And these new risks, they'll report them to what we call an emerging risk monitor. And that's a collaborative effort of all of the members of the risk committee. And that monitor is updated throughout the year. And then at the end of the year, through our annual process, we evaluate those risks. And the risk owners will tell us how they feel those risks may interact with other risks in our portfolio, or whether or not that risk is becoming imminent. We have a commitment to a robust ERM program, and we knew that emerging risk was something that we needed to keep on our radar. And so we knew that traditional risk management techniques weren't going to work, traditional frameworks for analyzing it wasn't going to work. And so we analyzed what others did in the industry and did something that fit our organization. We basically run it through an entirely separate process, but as a risk becomes more material to us, it actually gets incorporated into our existing risk portfolio. We had an idea that the use of drones would have a big impact on agriculture. And in early 2012, we hadn't heard a whole lot about drones being used in agriculture, but we decided that we'd do some investigation on it. And in 2012, the FAA had published a paper that had talked about the exposures and integrating drones into US airspace. And so because we write a lot of agricultural risks, or we reinsure companies that write a lot of agricultural risks, we really felt like we needed to stay ahead of this. So in 2013, we researched and wrote a white paper on the use of drones in agriculture and explored some of the potential impacts it may have for some of the companies. And then we took the white paper and sent it out and then developed a solution so that when it came to fruition, we would have a product available for our customers. And just recently, the FAA has started issuing Section 333 exemptions. And so there are actual agricultural operators using drones legally in their business today, even though they haven't published their guidelines for small UAVs. So we were excited to have something in place ready to go. We understood the exposure as best we could at that time. It's still evolving. It's something that's still changing rapidly, and how it will be used is evolving. But we felt better prepared for it, and we had a solution in hand. We try to do early detection so that we can get out in front of it and be prepared for it. And then we consider the risk factors surrounding it, how that might change our existing portfolio today or in the future. We try to take a forward-looking approach at it because that risk will evolve, and so will our environment. And we also consider how imminent that risk may be or how material that risk may be for our organization. One of the things that we do is we encourage members of the risk committee and risk owners to actually keep this in mind, keep it in the forefront, be constantly scanning when they're at trade shows, when they're at industry conferences, when they're reading publications, when they attend meetings for training or learning, to be thinking about these things and really think about how that risk might change what we're doing today. Because originally you may not think that it's going to impact your organization. It might be something that you think, well, that just really doesn't have much to do with us. But if you really sit and explore those risks and relate it to your existing risk portfolio, sometimes there's things that you hadn't thought of. And so we try to extrapolate from past experiences. So what if this thing that happened before happened all of the time? Or what if this thing that happened before happened in a much larger way? And also, existing risks can be emerging risks when they interact differently with the existing risks in your portfolio. So you can have like a systemic effect where you have a risk that used to behave a certain way, and now all these changing risks in the portfolio, it's behaving a different way. And to us, that's an emerging risk as well.
So Lori is a member of our ERM committee. Our company also won an honorable mention award for our ERM award that we do every year. I've included this slide because these are the points that Lori made in her talk there. So these will be, again, be available for you in the handout that we have for you. But she talks about this risk radar, that we keep this on our radar. Again, forward-looking, not dealing with the past, but really considering different trends that might affect the business and being adaptable and prepared when something does occur. So I wanted to share this one. This is another one of those eye charts where you can't read it from where you're sitting, but again, you'll get a copy of this. This is a chart, well, this is from a Canadian company that has US operations, so I felt okay about including it in this presentation. But she actually does a chart like this, and things will move from, we've kind of monitoring it, we're looking at it, oh, now it's moved to something that's more imminent, and we need to actually action it. So she reports to the board during her regular risk management reporting and monitoring on this. And this is a chart that they find very, very interesting. And they'll tell her, you know, there's something coming that we need to include in this chart, and then we want you to keep an eye on. We don't think it's imminent, but it's something that we think in the next 4 to 5 years may occur. So just an example. And then, of course, Zurich has a very sophisticated risk radar chart that they use as well. We do have on our website Linda Conrad, who also was on our ERM committee, who helped with this particular presentation that we did, a video of her talking about the Zurich risk radar as well. So feel free to go out and look that up on our risk knowledge area. But Zurich has a very sophisticated way of the way they look at also over time, but also how big of an impact that particular risk that they're monitoring might have. So that takes us to our third trend, and this is one we're kind of excited that we've been exploring over the last few years, is that intersection of risk, reputation, and decision-making. Our Strategic Risk Management Development Council has been looking at reputation. We've got a few slides from some of the work that they've done as well. We decided that, and as we looked at different surveys, we saw people putting together brand and reputation. And one of the first things we said, you know, brand is really different from reputation. Brand is what you're putting in front of people that you hope they believe. It's your logo, it's your name, it's how you feel about your organization and what you're putting into your advertising to distinguish your services, products from others, from your competitors. The reputation is really the good name of your organization. It's more about how your consumers feel about your organization and what you do. It's the relationship that they have with you. I remember talking to the corporate director of risk management for Starbucks, and I I said something about their products, and he said, oh, we don't sell coffee. I said, what, you don't sell coffee? Last time I was there, I had coffee. He said, we sell an experience. We have people who write to us about their Starbucks, and they were unhappy at the way the barista treated them at their Starbucks. It's an experience that they're selling. Coca-Cola, beverage? No, they're selling enjoyment. They want you to develop a lifestyle. That's how you feel about that brand, how you interact with that organization. There is a reputation index out there, a global reputation index. I don't know how many of you are familiar with it or have looked at it, but they will rank organizations or companies based on their reputation. And these are the results from the last report that they put out. There's a global report, and then they also do one by region. So they have one for China, they have one for Mexico. I'm not sure if they have one for South Africa. I should have checked that before I came. But so which brands are most, have the highest reputation within that year? And then we started looking at, as the members of our Strategic Risk Management Development Council, what constitutes reputation? Well, the Corporate Reputation Institute looks at products and services. That's no surprise. They look at innovation, how innovative is the company? What is the condition of the workplace? Citizenship, are they good corporate citizens? Do they help out the areas in which they operate? How well are they governed? And then leadership and performance, how well are they performing? So those first 7 attributes that are on here, or dimensions as we call them, are what they include in their index. But when we talked about it and we were researching it and we were talking to risk professionals, we found that there were also other influencers on your reputation. It might be your external partners. We had that situation at one time where I worked, that it was a supplier who breached an agreement that we had cascaded into our relationship with them, which created a problem for one of our clients. So your external partners can definitely influence your reputation. Creditors, in their opinion of your ability to repay debt, can influence your reputation. Not only your ability to borrow, but how your customers feel about you as well, and your other stakeholders. Regulators, if they determine that a particular, and I'm just making this up, element in mining is a problem, that could affect your reputation as well. So regulators also have an impact. And then the industry. If your competitors are up to something that is not seen as positive in the media or their social media activity, about your organization or your industry, that could also affect your reputation. So these are the elements that we came up with, and there may be more. So if you've come across something that's not listed here, please let us know. We will revisit this as well again. So as part of, as we start thinking about reputation, I wanted to bring up an organization that hopefully you're all familiar with, General Motors, and looking at a situation they had with 2020 hindsight. So this is a snapshot of General Motors. General Motors has been around a long time. They were formed in 1908, so over 100 years. They did emerge from bankruptcy, what they call the new GM, in 2009. Significant revenue, significant assets, and the number of employees. These are all factors from 2012, and I wanted to position this in 2012 because that's when their CRO made a presentation at one of our ERM conferences. So I'm going to share with you some of what the view of his view of what was occurring in GM at the time that he made his presentation, and we'll also hear from several executives from GM at that time about their views about risk management. So their customers are listed, and you can see their sales performance there. So just a snapshot. This is their purpose, and this is from their website more recently. So their single purpose, their mission, we were talking about mission earlier, to earn customers for life. So that's their core mission, They want to earn your loyalty. They want you to continue to buy GM cars. So there's a way, their strategy about going through that is deliver great products to our customers. Lead the industry in quality and safety, because if you're going to put your family in a vehicle, you want it to be a quality vehicle and a safe vehicle. Improving the ownership experience. So beyond just having a great vehicle, really looking at when you go to the dealership, what's your experience there? Is it good, bad, you care? And then they want to lead in technology and innovation. Their stated strategy, we're going to grow our brands. They've invested heavily in China. They want to continue that. They want to continue the growth of GM Financial. They want to deliver a core operating efficiencies. Who doesn't have that as part of their strategy? And then they have financial metrics that they want to meet. Okay, does this look familiar? And so there's some statistics there on their 2015 financial performance that they've just came out on that report. So I'm just trying to give you a background. So this is an interesting exercise. This is not a GM SWOT that they've developed. It's one I developed. So I went back and looked at their risk factors in their annual reporting. And from what they said, developed the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and threats. So you can see some of this deals with economic downturn and threats, the intense competition, disruptive technology, but turning some of that on its side, the opportunities, car and ride sharing. So they're looking at the Ubers of the world. They're looking at with the autonomous cars and cars that drive themselves. Are people really going to own cars anymore? And how do they turn that decision point into an opportunity? And alternative fuel vehicles, that they've been involved in electric vehicles for some time, to the market. And this concept of looking from a short-term perspective to a long-term perspective, how often have you heard decisions taken for the quarter, for the near term as opposed to the longer term? I had this situation, one of the risks that we had identified because we were looking in an organization I was with, we had contact centers situated because of the labor market. And one of the things we knew would be coming is that arbitrage, that labor rates would begin to increase as we began to build middle income families within these emerging markets. And I mentioned that to one of our, I won't tell you which executive, and he said, you know, I'm going to be retired before that happens. I don't know that I care. Okay, so understanding the culture, understanding that people are taking decisions for different reasons is an important part of what we do. So I wanted to share with you what the CRO of GM shared with us at our ARM conference. I'm taking you back to 2012. They had a very significant and well-developed governance structure. I know that's really important, particularly in South Africa, with the King 3 and now with King 4. That governance is really important, and they had a very robust governance structure, and they did report to the board, and the board was engaged. They had a defined risk process that was cascaded throughout the organization, and their business unit managers were utilizing. They had training, they had meetings, they had a lot of conversations, they had good cross-functional alignment. This is like model risk management. This is great. It was built at the C-suite. They had risk officers embedded in the organization who communicated with each other, embedding risk management throughout the organization and the improvements that they were able to gain from that cross-functional structure and network. And you can see how well that was embedded in 2012. And the open communication and the encouragement from a cultural standpoint to, as he said, pick up the phone, that approach across their network. They had a defined and integrated risk appetite and accountabilities for risk within their organization. So again, check the box. They had all of this going for them. It was really a very, very impressive. So let's kind of step back for a moment. And let's look at a hypothetical risk, and I kept it with the auto industry just for the sake of not changing industries here. Then the hypothetical question we want to ask on this risk, and looking at how we look at risk, are we as risk professionals actually capturing the places where risk and objectives most clearly intersect? And we talk a lot about risk management supports good decision making. Risk management deals with the organization's objectives, but do we really understand where those intersect? So this is a typical bow tie. This is not going to be a surprise to you. So you've got a situation where a tire falls off while the occupant is driving. And you look at what caused it from the perspective, and then what can you do to prevent the severity of the damage on the right side? What are the consequences of that tire falling off while driving? Well, there might be injuries, there might be property damage, there might be loss of use, and so we're going to put seat belts and airbags in cars to prevent the injuries if the tire falls off, and loss of use will give them a loaner car while we're repairing the vehicle. As we look at what occurred, we see that there might be low quality materials used. There might be no supervision on the assembly line, or they may have hired unqualified staff. Well, we go back and fix that by looking at the material specification and maybe modifying those materials. We might deliver some additional training and add skills to the labor force. So that's our typical response. Would you agree? That's pretty good, right? Bow tie. But let's look at what occurred before that happened. So their objective was to produce safe tires for sports cars. I made that up. The low quality materials, there was a decision made in engineering as to what were the materials they're specifying. There was a decision made there. From a no supervision, management took a decision that these workers could work with no or limited supervision. There was a decision made. Whether that was based on financials or what, just don't have the number of supervisors we need, don't know. And then from unqualified staff, from an operations and HR perspective, did they really understand what the skill set was needed? But a decision was taken as that, as in some organizations, and the hypothetical one might be one of them, if they pass the mirror test. You know what the mirror test is, right? You put the mirror up, and if they're breathing, they're hired. That's so. But in terms of what causes this, there are decisions that have occurred prior to that. So if we think about decision making and risk management and where they intersect, and we go back to Dr. Spetzler's decision making model, there are questions that we should be asking as risk managers. What's the issue or need defined? And the question is this what we really want to do? I remember when I was working at one of my organizations, and I had this conversation with our VP of operations, and she said, you know, our technology people are creating some really cool stuff. It's whiz-bang cool, but our customers don't want it. So the first decision is this worth solving? Is this worth doing? What are the alternatives? So there's a series of questions. What are the options available? How effective or disruptive will this be? So there are a number of questions. My favorite one is, what are the unintended consequences if we do this? Because it's something we don't often think about. As far as meaningful and reliable alternatives and having the good information, is the information that we're utilizing in order to take this decision reasonable? Is it reliable? Do we have good data? Are we relying on the past to predict the future? Maybe that's not the right way to do it. Maybe it's not looking at past losses and claims to predict what might occur in the future. Developing different options. What are the, how feasible, how acceptable are those? How effectively will they actually achieve the objective that we're trying to come to here? And then in terms of the correct and logical reasoning, and this is something we've included in the RIMS risk assessment standard that we just produced last September with ASIS, which is a worldwide security association. What were the biases? Decisions are taken and there's reasoning taken, but we all come with our own biases. I often laugh when people say, you know, we need to de-bias this. Well, you can't debias people's own experiences. And your experience is going to be different than my experience. My point of view is going to be different. How does that come into play in this logical and correct reasoning? And then acting on the decision, do we really have the right resources available? Do we have the right staff? Do we have the right specifications? So as you think about the decision model and how we play into that full decision model from a risk management perspective to help address some of those uncertainties, we can see now that had they done that, they wouldn't have had the tires falling off the darn car to begin with. So the management objective to produce the safe cars for sports cars, we obviously know there are uncertainties regarding quality, staffing, and training. There may be others. There may be other uncertainties that need to be addressed as well. So we assess the risk, determine whether it's okay or not. If it's okay, we continue with a willingness to accept risk. What we've decided, we will accept a certain amount of risk for the reward. We go on with that resulting activity, and then we monitor it, and we detect changes, and we make adjustments as we go forward. So we're reassessing risk all along the way before we actually achieve our objective. And if it's not okay, do we decide to implement modifications to the plan, or do we decide we're not going to actually pursue this? So you can see how risk management plays throughout the entire decision process. From the CFO of Citigroup. And his comment was they were looking at these collateral debt obligations as through a market risk lens. So they were looking at how can we gain a portion of this market, because the banks were making a pretty good dollar from these CDOs, but they weren't looking at them from a credit risk perspective. So they weren't looking at concentration. They weren't looking at it through the right lens. So I think what the executive from GM reminds us of is that we need to be looking at these on a more ecosystem basis. We need to identify those risks and understand how they play out. So this is a quote. We also interviewed the CRO for a report that we were doing on transitioning to enterprise risk management. And he made this comment about the ability to be both objective and transparent when talking about risk and opportunities, and it's a shift to really try to get everyone in a room to talk openly. So he recognized within his own culture that people may not be willing to come forward with things that might go wrong. It might be part of their culture to hold cards close to the vest. During this transition, GM also got a new CEO, Mary Barra. I don't know if any of you are familiar with her. She's quoted quite a bit. But she was ahead of their product development area, and when the previous CEO retired, she took over. And I think it was early 2014. And then they had a recall. I don't know if you recall this, but it was a problem with the ignition switch, that if you had any weight on it, it might turn off at inopportune times. And at the time, they had 13 deaths that they knew about. And they had to recall over 1,620,000 cars, vehicles. Creative destruction? Did it add to their value, or was it detrimental? Okay, it's okay. Detrimental, it's good. So they announced this recall in March of 2014. So I'm going to ask you just to spend a minute or two at your table and answer this question. How much do stakeholders care? And what do you think the impact to GM was and to their reputation? Just real quickly. This event occurred, and I'll help you with the answer afterwards, but just think about this. Okay, I'm just going to ask a quick question. Was this a really big impact to GM? Yes or no? Yes, okay. It certainly got media attention, didn't it? So Mary Barra went in front of our Congress, and she was questioned, I think, a couple of times in 2014. And she accepted responsibility, and the number of cars recalled grew to another 1 million. And they have an estimated repair cost that's still on their books of about 400 million related to the ignition problem. So that's obviously 400 million that they could not put back into the business to create their electric cars and other things. So you can see the impact that that had on them. And it doesn't include the litigation on the number of deaths, which obviously increased as well. And they talk about that litigation in their report. So what would you expect the impact to GM's reputation to be? Pretty big? Yeah, GM's got a pretty good reputation, right? You'd expect this bad news to, okay? So there's an index out there, reputation index. So I like to run public companies against this to say, okay, what was the impact? This index that I'm going to show you about in a minute takes hundreds of companies that are publicly traded, and again, there are attributes that the people who put this index together look at, and they say these are low valued, we expect their value to increase because of their reputation. So that's the thinking behind it, whether you buy that theory or not. And I've had some professors say, I'm not sure I believe that. But I thought, well, let's look at GM against this reputation index and see how they did. Is it what you expected? Yep, they took a dip when the recall was announced. Yep, they took a dip when she was reporting to Congress. Was it as big of a dip as you might have expected? No. Why do you think that is? So I hear murmuring. Loyalty. Confidence in the brand. That my experience with GM has been really good. So they've built this reputation up that people will, as Dr. Walker said, forgive a few of these things that happen. Okay? So I want to take this in the context of decisions, because obviously a decision was taken by someone within GM as they saw this problem occurring not to escalate it. So as we look at the whole thought process of selecting logical choices from the available options that we talked about before, and when taking a good decision, the person really needs to weigh the positive and negative of each of those options and consider all the alternatives. So I'm going to ask you, the person within GM, and I don't know who this is, I don't have any inside information, but someone within GM took the decision not to escalate the problem. Did they consider all of the alternatives? No. So, and looking to the future in terms of what the consequences of that decision that they took, didn't really occur to them. It got back to the culture that had grown out of GM, the old GM. So is managing risk part of objective setting? That's kind of the question that comes out of this. Is it part of the decision making from the very start through execution? Yes, it's an easy answer. So right now we're testing a hypothesis. We looked at a good decision and a bad decision, and we all decided that what ostensibly was a good decision could come up with a bad outcome. So we're looking at, could a good risk management program, such as what GM have, help you depending on your reputation? So there's this intersection between decisions, good reputation, good risk management, bad risk management, and the outcomes. So the hypothesis is if you've got good risk management and a really good reputation, the outcome's going to be pretty good. If you've got good risk management and a bad reputation, you're going to have a bad outcome. But it might be a smaller one than if you had bad risk management and a bad reputation, which is going to be really, really big. But if you have a good reputation, even if you've got bad risk management, you might have a good outcome. So this whole conversation around, well, if you just have good risk management, you're golden, you're going to be fine. as risk professionals, we need to understand that it's not just about risk management, it's about the organization, it's about the reputation of the organization and the culture of the organization as well, and how all of those intersect to create good decisions that have actually good outcomes. So I don't know if your organizational culture can be described with the superlatives that are here: people-oriented, innovative, teamwork, shared values, stable, good outcomes. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, if you describe it. But underneath, does it look like that? So just something to think about. So I hope you've enjoyed these trends. I do have my contact information. I would love to hear from you and take any of your questions at this time. We've got a few minutes left. Comments, questions? It's too late to withdraw from the course. Yes. I couldn't tell if you were stretching or actually. Okay. Okay.
One of the best slides that we had was talking about defining strategic risk management.
So could you repeat your question so people can hear?
Okay. I'm saying one of the slides that we had was defining strategic risk management. Now, I have a concern with risk management defining, categorizing risk in a particular sense. In that, when you do categorization, you categorize based on what the organization already, how the organization has already categorized itself. Mm-hmm. So, if you have a strategy department, when you define strategic risk, then it's a risk referred to. It's a risk related to the strategy department or to what the strategy department is doing.
So if I can rephrase your question a little bit, it's how does risk management intersect with strategy planning? You think they're already doing risk management? No.
No.
Okay. Tell me again.
Okay. I'm referring more to the different classifications that we have as risk management.
Okay.
And wanting to define, to categorize risk from a risk management point of view. Because then we're looking at the organization from a risk management point of view. We're not looking at risk management from an organization point of view.
Okay.
Should we not, when categorizing risk or classifying risk, mm-hmm. classify them based on how the organization itself has classified itself?
Excellent.
Then
okay.
a definition for strategic risk, for instance, will depend on how the organization, on what the strategy department is actually doing, and then you define your strategic risk based on that particular, on what the organization is already doing from a strategy point of view.
Okay, now I understand. Is there a danger in what we do as risk managers in categorizing risks? It's falling into these nice, neat buckets because it's easier to think about them that way. We all do that. This is a strategic risk. This is an operational risk. And is that really relevant to the organization? Do they really care how you're bucketing it when they may have a different perspective as they're going into strategy?
I think just to add on that, it's not just about the categorization of the risk, but categorizing it outside of how the organization itself has been categorized.
Okay, so it's really how is it integrated with what the organization is already categorizing risk, how they're thinking about risk.
I mean, if you can't have, in my opinion, you cannot have a strategic risk if you not have a strategic department, because obviously the organization itself has not seen strategy as a category within the organization to look at.
Okay, so there are only two questions to what you just asked me. So can you have a strategy without a strategy department? The answer is yes. Your CEOs and your boards taking on strategy, whether or not you've got a formal strategy organization. And do they have an opinion about risk and risk categorization? Yes, they do. And they may not agree with how you're categorizing risk. I would always have individual meetings with each of our business leaders to validate where we were putting things. And understand that risk categorization is only a mechanism to help people understand. And I'll share this story from Microsoft. They will look at a risk that they've categorized as a strategic risk or another risk, and as things develop, they may move it. I'll give you an actual example of an organization who had a compliance risk. They thought it was dealing with regulatory. And management took a decision as they were trying to go through a sale of the business. This regulatory risk became a strategic risk. So can it move across? Yes. Should you be mindful of that? Absolutely. From a risk radar perspective, as Microsoft looks across their universe and what they're looking at, they're also listening. They're listening externally to customers. And one of the things that their head of risk management and internal audit, the senior executive, said that he loves having risk management report to him. Not because they find bad things, because they're listening. And he said, my ERM people, ERM Enterprise Risk Management people, will come to me and they'll say, you know, we're listening to customers and they're looking for this solution. Is this something our engineers can do? And oh, voila, they have a new product line. So that whole concept of creating value, so the cautionary tale that I think you're trying to tease out is the fact that we can't get too ingrained in what we do, and we have to really be responsive to the organization. I had a CFO tell me one time, Carol, it's not about risk management, it's about our business. Okay, I learned that one. So yes, very, very good point. We do have to be careful with the techniques that we use, that we don't try to make it all about risk management, but really be responsive to what the organization is trying to do. I started out with asking about your mission. So as you're doing risk management, as you're doing your daily job, you need to go back to that mission statement saying, is this supporting our mission? Great point. Thank you for bringing it up. Any other questions?
Hi. Sorry, the concept of risk behavior and incentive structures, I think it's currently looked at by financial institutions at the moment quite closely to say how does incentive structures impact on level of risk taking on and behavior.
So you noticed in our report that performance management was one of the highest rating to increase firm value. So you do have to, I had one CEO tell me, you know, we got more value out of our organization once we told people it was okay to fail. So the concept of are we risk takers, are we risk adverse, and are we doing performance management, are we rewarding people for the right things is something I think that we do have a role in to help our HR people understand that our performance objectives may not be aligned with the risk appetite of the organization or what the organization is really trying to do. So if I may, I'd like to turn that question around. So in your own organizations, are you being compensated based on the strategic risk management that the organizations say they want you to do? You don't have to answer that out loud, because we've actually studied that. And we find that people are not. Our performance is based on our budgets. And sometimes our budgets are based on insurance premiums. And how much have you been able to reduce our insurance premiums? It's got nothing to do with strategy. Might be operational, you're taking a little bit of the operation out of it, but it's not the bigger picture. So one of the things that RIMS would like to do, and I'd like to work with the institutes on this as well, let's come up with our own compensation system that really reflects what we're trying to do. And if we can help organizations understand how they should be looking at risk professionals and how they should be compensating our performance, I think that would be huge. Be huge for the organizations because they'll get more value out of their risk professionals as well. So did I hit on what you were asking? Any other questions?
Good morning. There's here I am. You're looking for me.
It's a little dark for me.
In South Africa, we've got the King Code of Corporate Governance. It's in its third iteration. The fourth one is in draft form. It's driven risk management in South Africa to a large extent, but it caused a lot of companies to start off at a very low maturity base. There was a tick box exercise just to from a compliance to the corporate governance measures, and companies are slowly emerging into bigger risk maturity. So contrasting that to the US, there isn't that sort of corporate governance driving force apart possibly from Sarbanes-Oxley that I'm aware of. So I wanted to just get your perspective on what is driving risk management and increasing risk maturity in the US versus the situation here, and whether it's good or bad, whether you have that legislative or compliance-driven driving force sitting behind the emergence of the discipline.
Great question. Once we got over kind of the whole Sarbanes-Oxley tick-the-box sort of compliance role, we started to gain momentum on risk management when organizations began to realize the value that could be created. We did have regulations from the SEC, our Security and Exchange Commission, for publicly traded companies that risk management had to be a topic of conversation from the board perspective. It's a very small paragraph within some regulations that they put out. We tried to engage them to define what experienced risk professional was, because they talk about a risk professional in the regulation. There were disclosures that needed to be made about risk management in the public reports. So we did have a little bit of that, not to the extent that you had with the King Code. But I like to think about risk management in the U.S. as being viral. What's really been driving it, and we thought it was the rating agencies, because the rating agencies in the U.S., Standard & Poor's and others said, you know, you have to have a robust risk management program, and we thought that was going to be our driver. It wasn't, because they weren't really showing any results from what they said they would want to do, and I'm not sure they understood it totally as well. What it was were board members sitting within an organization that had a robust risk management program, going and serving on another board and saying, we need this here. We're seeing problems that we think you can solve by having a robust risk management program in place. I had a personal situation. We had our program. Our CEO was a big believer in what we were doing. He became the head of audit on a board of a healthcare company. And my CFO came to me one day and he says, you're going to get a call because Jim has just told that organization they need to have a robust enterprise risk management program, and they're going to call you to see what we're doing. And sure enough, I got a call from the director of risk management, and he said, thank you so much. I've been trying to get this ingrained in our organization for the last 2 years, and I've not had any impetus. So it really has been the board. And we have sometimes resistant management because and I think it has to do with biases and fears, that they believe risk management's going to take over and not really understanding that we're going to help them take better decisions. Because if we went and we told them, this is really going to improve your ability to have good information and think about consequences and take better decisions, who wouldn't want that? But yes, it's not been regulation per se, except in our financial institutions, very heavily there. And it does become more of a compliance function than a more robust strategic risk management function. Yes.
Hi, Carol. Thanks for a good presentation. My question to you is, I think when I look back to the presentation that you did, you had one of the clip with the Chief Risk Officer of GM, where he was putting emphasis in terms of long-term planning. Mm-hmm. And my question to you will be, do you think maybe if you look into the pace at which things are changing today, in the world, is there a need for us to really look into the importance of long-term planning? Because sometimes you find that maybe even as government, we might have this 30-year strategy, which when you move 5 years down the line, you actually realize that it doesn't talk to what is happening currently.
I think it's human nature somewhat. The answer is, going back to the concept of long-term versus short-term and the role that risk management can play. I think as humans, we tend to want to solve problems that are on our plate immediately. And the faster we do it and the faster pace that we live in, the faster we want to make that happen. I mean, I just asked you about Google, and what did I hear? I get immediate information. That's what organizations are looking for. So I think it is important, as risk professionals, we ask the question, well, what are the consequences going to be 3 to 4 years out? To have that time frame in place as organizations start thinking about the decisions that they're taking. Because they do have very long-term, and with the pension obligation for GM, obviously a very, very long-term impact on that organization. So I think it's a critical part that we play in terms of raising those questions over the long term. Not every CEO is going to agree with you. Not every CFO who's looking at a quarterly statement is going to agree with you. But I think, as I had one colleague say to me, we learn from others. So if you can find others in your industry who have taken short-term solutions that ended up either damaging their reputation or ending up in an event that they might not have had, you can learn from others. They don't have to happen to your organization, and start talking about the longer term. I think that really is more meaningful when you can use actual examples. Is that helpful?
Carol?
Yes.
What key skills do you think a risk manager should develop to effectively engage with an executive board?
Okay, so I'll use the word competencies. You use the word tools. Competencies does a risk professional need in order to effectively engage with a board? Number one, you have to understand your audience. Number two, one of the core domains that we have in our certification is strategy. If you don't understand strategy and how organizations come up with their strategies and what they're doing long term, it's really hard to have that conversation, to talk about implications to strategy, because that's what the boards are concerned about. I had a conversation with a previous member of our ERM committee when we were talking about strategic risk management. He says, I don't understand why you're doing this, RIMS. You know, it's about all the risks that we have. And I kept saying, John, but this is what the board's interested in. They're interested in strategy. Fast forward. So we had a very robust conversation. Fast forward 2 weeks, I get a phone call from John. He said, I thought I would eat crow now while it's still fresh. I wanted to share with you, my CFO just left the office. And what he said as we're getting ready for our board report is the board said to him, we think you've got your operational risk under control. We're pretty satisfied with that. We want you to come and talk only about strategic risks. So the fact that they're interested, so you know what your audience wants, they want it in short clips. So you've got to have presentation skills as well to be able to talk to not only the board, but also on the factory floor or the hotel or the mine people, to be able to be flexible enough that we're not talking in riskies, but we're really talking in the language of the business and what they're trying to accomplish.
Thank you.
Okay. Question over here. Thank you.
Specifically in the financial industry. So especially in insurance, there's an increasing drive, or in fact most regulations already require that risk management plays, you know, a second line of defense kind of role, which I guess goes a bit against much of the sort of role that you sort of advocating, that it's more strategic, more involved in decision making. And whilst I like what you're discussing, I'd like to hear what your views are on, you know, how to balance that, how can I say, act between first and second line sort of role. Okay. And whether or not risk management should be at an executive decision-making, it would be in that sort of capacity. Okay.
So the first question I heard was that particularly in financial institutions, because of the regulations, and I will say also from a COSO perspective, there's always been this view of risk management as a compliance role. A second line of defense, I think, is how it's described in the COSO framework. And how does that play into what I've just talked about from a strategic standpoint? I tell my friends in internal audit that, yes, we play the second line of defense. We've been doing that for a long time. We've been protecting the value of the organization since we began to do risk management. We've always done that. But we can play offense too. Oh, I said, don't label us as just defensive players. We're both. So there is a balance. And what we're trying to do is shift the focus of risk professionals not from the protective side, because that's what we do. In any risk report you see, it's not the hazard risk that get people in trouble. It's the strategic risks. So we've been playing that role for some time. So it is a bit of an evolution. And the second part of the question, help me remember what it was, because I went off on a tangent there, sorry.
I think, if I remember correctly, I think most of it related to whether or not it's appropriate for risk management to be involved in decision making, because I think that creates an inherent conflict. Right.
So how do we become more engaged as a strategic risk leader?
Yeah,
if I may rephrase what you're asking.
Without being in a position where we end up checking our own recommendations or our own decision making, right?
Yes. So how do we get more involved in decision making, which is a great question. The thinking behind that is a couple of different things. Is number one, we can't approach everything from a risk management perspective, and it really does have to be about the business. When you know it's changed in your organization is when you're adding a very valuable input, or what I call consulting, internal consulting to the process, where people will turn to you as they start a project and say, we want you to be engaged. I had a situation with a chief information officer. We had about a 3-month period where we were in transition, so we went out with his team of directors and created a risk report for him. And when I sat down with him on it, he basically said, I knew about that, I suspected that, oh, I didn't know about that. All of a sudden, the value of risk management went up in his esteem. Now, I talked from an IT perspective, so I'd done my homework, and I knew the difference between ITIL and some of the other IT types of frameworks. So, number one, talking the way they talk, and then understanding what they're trying to accomplish. They will get you engaged. The outcome of that, he asked me to train 300 of his managers, and he had 17 strategic initiatives that he was going to embark on, and he wanted me involved in every one of them, or my team. So you have to gain the credibility, you've got to gain the respect, and then you are invited to help with those strategic decisions. The short story, hopefully short, as we went through one of his initiatives, and they assumed what their risks were, and I had the director come in and say, Carol, how can I meet your objectives? I tried to tell him it wasn't about me, it was really about him. And as we went through the list of risks on his particular objective, we're going through the results from his own team, and he said, we're about ready to give away the secret sauce. And I said, gee, is that about what you're trying to do or what I'm trying to do? And he said, oh, I can see application for this in other areas. So it's getting that buy-in, seeing the successes, and having those testimonials across the organization will get people calling you as opposed to you calling them, trying to become engaged. It's not enough for us as risk professionals to say, I want a seat at the table. Who doesn't? We really have to show value in helping them with their decisions. So, okay, I think...
Hi, Carol.
Yes.
Sorry, just a quick question. How important do you think is the use of technology in risk management? So in other words, enablers to get the information quickly, to have immediate reports. And also second to that is, do you think we need dedicated people to drive risk management in the organization? Because a lot of times what we see is risk management becomes an add-on to an existing job profile. Thanks.
Okay. So first question, first is technology important? If it's giving you reliable information, absolutely is. When you're dealing with information from various different sources, it's good to be able to integrate it. So, but it's a tool. It doesn't take over for risk management. Embedding risk management, I had a colleague who said, enterprise risk management stands for everyone's a risk manager. So it really, to me, my role as a facilitator in risk management is to build those competencies within the organization, because the more I've got people who understand risk management and are taking that, understanding it and applying it to all of the decisions they're taking, from big hairy decisions and a more robust risk management analysis to everyday kind of decisions where it's back of the napkin and it's more muscle memory, that you build those competencies. So I hope that answered your question. That's the view we've seen, and that's where we've seen success.